welcome to Heart, Soul, Mind, the regular weekly Bible study of St. Paul Lutheran Church in this winter-spring season of 2021 as we near the end of our study of the Bible's big stories. In this session, we will look at the telling of the seventh big stories that we're considering, this one about the early Jesus communities, the earliest communities that heard the gospel of Jesus Christ, the story of his resurrection, and organized themselves, came together as communities gathered around the meal that he left and the story that is told about him. There's a plausible history that we can imagine from what we know about the spread of the gospel, that the earliest community was made up of Jewish followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, probably under the leadership of Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, who was not one of the 12 disciples, but very quickly in the early community, probably because of his relationship with Jesus as a brother, took on a leadership role. We'll see more about that in the next session as we look at the retelling of this story, but we have little reason to doubt the picture of the earliest community being centered in Jerusalem, with Peter and James in particular as leaders. And then, as we saw in the retelling of the Passion by the gospel writer Mark, it's equally plausible to imagine that around the year 70, when the Romans destroyed the Jerusalem temple, that the Jerusalem community was driven out as a group that the Romans saw as simply one more sect of the Jews, and that Mark's community at least settled then in Galilee. Well, between the resurrection, somewhere around the late 20s of the first century, and the destruction of the temple in 70, what else might be going on? If there is a Jerusalem community, and we have every reason to believe there is, from that community we really have no records. But we do know that there was a fellow named Paul, who beginning sometime in the late 40s and until his likely death 14 or 15 years later, around 62 of the first century, was active in starting communities of Jesus believers and in traveling to them and in writing letters to them. And so it is Paul who offers us the best telling of the early Jesus communities through the hints and the images that he gives us in his letters. Let's take a look first at Paul's several journeys, which are a part of the handout that you are receiving with the link to this video. And I'll also show them here on the screen. In a sense, Paul has 5 journeys, although normally they're spoken of as 3 journeys, because his early travels, as you can see, are simply from Jerusalem up to Damascus, where he tells us he was going to persecute the believers in Jesus, as he had persecuted them in Jerusalem as a leading Jewish figure trained in the ways of the Pharisees. He calls it one of the most strict of the sects of Judaism. And in that life, in which he was known as Saul of Tarsus, he traveled up to Damascus with instructions from the Jerusalem Jewish leadership to find those who were following Jesus in the name of the God of Israel, and to bring them back to Jerusalem to be examined, to stand trial, to face yet more persecution. It's on that trip that Saul, as he is nearing Damascus, sees a great light, hears a voice, is struck to the earth and blinded for several days. And through that experience, hears his call, his commissioning. Not particularly a conversion, because there is no Christianity yet to which he could convert, but rather his commissioning as a Jew, as a firm believer in the God of Israel and in the Torah of Israel. Paul hears a commissioning to carry the word of Jesus as Israel's Messiah and the world's Christ to the Gentiles, to the people beyond Israel, whom God has now brought into view to be God's people alongside Israel. Paul goes off to Arabia, he says, for several years and comes back to Antioch and eventually goes back down to Jerusalem. These are known as Paul's early travels. We know not a lot about them except for that dramatic story as he approaches Damascus and then with the Jesus community in Damascus. His first journey per se, you can see here, is one that starts in Antioch and goes hugging the coast of Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, going between Pamphylia and Cyprus, as they were known then, over to Attalia and then Perga, and then up through Asia Minor to Antioch, another Antioch, and Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, back to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch and Perga, and then sailing to Cyprus, crossing it, and finally returning to Antioch, and then down to Jerusalem. On Paul's second journey, as you can see at the bottom, he begins in Jerusalem, goes overland up through much of the territory he had covered on his first journey, but ultimately ending up in Troas at the westernmost end of Asia Minor, and then crosses into Europe, going up into Philippi, Thessalonica, coming through Macedonia, and down into Greece, where he comes to Athens and Corinth, before sailing back with a stop in Ephesus, and finally stopping again in Cyprus, back to Jerusalem. Paul's third journey again begins in Antioch, takes him back up through his familiar territory of Cilicia and Galatia and across Asia Minor, back to Ephesus, then across to Macedonia, Thessalonica again, down to Corinth, back up, stop in Philippi, across to Troas, Mytilene, Miletus, down to Patara, and finally back to Tyre and down to Jerusalem. These three are his missionary journeys, as they're called, where he is both establishing and visiting Jesus communities across, as you can see, Syria, Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece. His final journey, the fifth one we might say, is the one that he takes as a prisoner from Jerusalem and Caesarea to Rome. This one is fairly straightforward, except for the fact that there's a shipwreck. They end up on the beach at Malta after basically being blown across the Mediterranean out of control all the way from Crete. And this is the journey then that on yet another boat takes Paul from Malta up onto the boot of Italy and to Rome, where our story about Paul comes to an end, even as it appears his life there comes to an end. Now, these journeys, as they are portrayed, are really a best approximation of what we know. Because indeed, in Paul's telling of his story, which comes not as an integrated historical account, but rather in, as I suggested, hints and images, references in his various letters, he doesn't really give us a connected itinerary for any of these. It is Luke writing perhaps a generation after Paul, certainly a couple of decades after Paul. It is Luke who makes Paul a major figure in the second half of his book of Acts and gives us a connected chronology of Paul's work and journeys. We'll look at that in our next session as the retelling of the early Christian communities. For now, we'll take Paul's word, as much as we can find, at face value and assemble out of his 7 authentic letters in the New Testament what we can of what those communities looked like, mostly in the 50s of the first century. I say of his 7 letters, we'll actually only look at 4 of them. Philemon is a very personal letter that really doesn't tell us much about the early communities at all. 2 Corinthians clearly is a subsequent correspondence with the community at Corinth, and we know more about Corinth probably than we do any of the other early Jesus communities. But there really isn't much in 2 Corinthians in terms of the life and shape of the community that we don't already see in 1 Corinthians. And finally, Romans ends up being a kind of final account, in the words of Christer Stendahl, a great New Testament Pauline scholar. It's Paul's last letter, as far as we can tell, and it reads as much like a summary theological treatise on Paul's understanding of the gospel and its significance for Jews and Gentiles. It reads as much like that as it does like any letter. So those 3 don't really particularly help us with understanding these early Jesus communities and their life. But there are 4 that do. 1 Thessalonians is likely Paul's earliest letter, and we'll be looking at 2 passages from it, one at the very beginning of chapter 2, where Paul references the fact that his treatment at Philippi before he came to Thessaloniki was not very positive, that they treated him harshly there, and that nevertheless he came to Thessaloniki. And when he came there, despite the fact that he might have claimed some privilege to be supported by them as the field that he was working, so to speak, he also uses that imagery in other letters, that nevertheless, he wanted to be no burden to them. He wanted to deal gently with them. And therefore, he worked night and day. And we can imagine that this is worked at a paying job night and day in order to be able to support himself so that he could bring the gospel to the Thessalonians. Then in chapter 5, we see more about the community, when he offers them counsel and advice. And this is actually how we get most of the picture of Paul's early Jesus communities, is through the things that he counsels them. Because in his counsel, we can imagine on the other side of that what the situation is that he feels the need to address. So he encourages them to esteem those who have charge over them. It sounds like there might be some contention or even perhaps what could be called insubordination. He knows what it is from his experience at Philippi to bring the gospel and not be treated well by the community. So his encouragement to the Thessalonians is that they treat those who are caring for them in the gospel with esteem and respect, and urges peace among them, a peaceable coexistence, characterized by patience with those who may not, by some human standard, measure up to the community's standards. And notice too that he encourages them not to despise the prophets or the words of the prophets, which sounds like, in this community at least, there were some who were understood to be prophets, to be those who could pronounce the word of the Lord to the times that they were living in. That's as much as we know about the Thessalonians. We can infer a bit more about them in terms of their beliefs and their attitudes, but in terms of characterizing the community, this is about what Paul offers us. If we then turn to, indeed, his letter to the Philippians, the people in that community where he presumably had not been treated very well, again, we look at chapter 4, and beginning with verse 2, we notice that he specifically encourages them to be supportive of two women whom he says were workers with him in the gospel. This, from other letters, the people that he greets at the end of other letters, the people that he names as leaders in the community, indicates that a good deal of Paul's support and a goodly number of his co-workers were indeed women. We might remember from the gospel retellings of the Passion that it is particularly the women who, in that earliest Jesus story about the Passion, as it gets retold in later generations, it was the women who were particularly remembered as accompanying Jesus, as helping to bury Jesus, and who were there on Easter morning after Jesus was raised. Here too, Paul's co-workers frequently include a goodly number of women, and some of them apparently fairly well-to-do, such that they could support an itinerant preacher. Well, as we move on in chapter 4 of Philippians, we see that he is grateful to the Philippians for the support that they gave him when he went to Thessaloniki. Remember, we just saw that he said to the Thessalonians, I didn't become a burden to you. I didn't expect you to support me. I worked night and day. And apparently, he also garnered support from the Philippians, who sent it with some of their own people to Thessaloniki in order to encourage Paul and to support him in his work there. Another glimpse into the way that these early Christian communities could support one another and had connections with one another. Well, Paul eventually gets to Corinth, and the congregation there is the one about which, as I suggested, we probably know the most, because we have two letters from Paul to the Corinthians. The second letter to the Corinthians actually probably includes fragments of several letters, So he was in pretty regular correspondence with these folks. And it's clear as we look at chapter 1, verses 13 and following, the beginning of our reading in 1 Corinthians, there are divisions in Corinth. If there's anything to remember about the early Jesus community in Corinth, it is they were divided. Paul starts by talking about the quibbling over just which apostle was it that brought the gospel to one or another of the members of the community. And Apollos was apparently one of the other significant apostles. And Paul says, frankly, it doesn't much matter whether it was Paul or Apollos. I didn't baptize anyone. Neither of us is the Lord Jesus Christ. Why are you quibbling over us? And he goes on in chapter 2 to say that with all of the diversity that apparently is present in the Corinthian congregation in terms of which apostle was involved with which of the subgroups in the congregation, and we'll see also in terms of a good deal of other diversity that shows up in the congregation, Paul says these things should not divide you. One lays a foundation, another builds on it. Which of them does the better work is not for us to decide or even think about. God may ultimately judge that, but that's up to God. For us, the key is to bring all of the diversity of Paul's work and Apollos' work and anyone else's work on behalf of the gospel, bring it together into a unified building up of the community so that you are a testimony to the one God. The Corinthians needed to hear that because as the first letter to the Corinthians goes on, it is clear that there are any number of points of division. In chapters 5 through 15 of this letter, there are evident divisions within the community that manifest themselves in lawsuits, where one member of the community is suing another member of the community. And Paul says, why are you taking it to the civil courts? You should be settling that among yourselves. There's division about whether people in the community can eat food that has previously been offered to idols, to the Roman gods of the empire. There's division about head coverings for women and whether they're necessary or not. There's division about spiritual gifts, speaking in tongues and prophecy and the like, and about what role they have in worship. Those are the things about which there's explicitly division. Paul also gives advice on a number of other topics in these 11 chapters from 5 through 15, on sexual immorality, on marriage, on the actual worship of idols, on meals of the community, both the Lord's Supper and also the way in which they share their meals or don't with other members of the community. And finally, on the resurrection. All of these were questions for the Corinthian congregation, some of them explicitly creating divisions within the community, some of them perhaps questions that had been raised to Paul because there was unclarity, uncertainty, and they looked to their apostle for the kind of explanation that would help them to rest easy and move forward. Well, those are the pictures we get of the kinds of Jesus communities that Paul was working with. We would imagine, because there is a certain amount of consistency here of theme, that many of the early Jesus communities were just like this. And I'll recap what just like this might have been in a moment. But first, I'd like to take a look at that fourth letter of Paul's, the letter to the Galatians. And here we turn to Paul in his specific relationship to the early Jesus community in Jerusalem. Because here again, we find some significant conflict. In writing to the folks in Galatia, Paul's concern, and it is an urgent concern from the way that he writes, his concern is that there are those who are telling them that they cannot be Gentile people of God without taking on the practices of the Torah that are known to the Jewish people. And Paul is incensed. Paul, from everything I can tell, has no serious problem with Jews, even Jews who believe in Jesus as he does, has no problem with their continuing to follow the Jewish lifestyle that is profiled and the gift of God, in fact, in the Torah. But the faith by which God has called Israel and given them the Torah, Paul says, is the same faith by which God now calls the Gentiles in Jesus Christ and gives them Jesus' new commandment. It is not the Torah. It is a lifestyle shaped by the gifts of the Spirit, which he names at the end of his letter to the Galatians in chapter 5: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. But apparently there are those in Galatia troubling the Galatians with the insistence that they must adopt the Torah lifestyle of the Jewish people. And that gets symbolized, summarized, one might say embodied in the sign of circumcision especially. Well, Paul will have none of it. And he talks in this first and second chapter of his letter to the Galatians about how it is that he became the apostle to the Gentiles and what his relationship is with those in Jerusalem who are Jesus followers from the Jewish community, and how they have accepted and affirmed his mission to the Gentiles. Now, part of the reason that I bring this is that Luke, in his retelling of the early Jesus community story, will tell this one a bit differently. But let's just take a look at Paul's description, and I'll remind you of it in our next session so that we can see the comparison. Here in Galatians, Paul talks about this in terms of his commissioning experience on that road to Damascus, and then the chronology of his life and his interaction with the leaders in Jerusalem. He notes that he was previously a persecutor of the church. In that role, he was going to Damascus, and he had his commissioning experience, whereupon he went directly to Arabia, he says, after a few days in Damascus, and only after 3 years and coming back to Damascus did he then go down to Jerusalem. And in that, he was there only 15 days, saw only Cephas, that's Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus. But then, with their approval, he went off to Syria and Cilicia. He is, after all, Saul of Tarsus, now Paul, and Cilicia is the place where Tarsus is? Well, he says it was 14 years later before he came back to Jerusalem, this time with his co-workers Barnabas and Titus. And it was there, in what appears to be a somewhat tense but ultimately resolved engagement with one another, that the two sides finally agree that just as the Jerusalem leaders are carrying the gospel message to the Jewish community, so Paul has their affirmation and confidence to go to the Gentiles. And he says, all they asked of me was that we remember the poor, which we were going to do anyway. The poor presumably reflecting those Jerusalem believers themselves, and at least the poor in their community. And then there's the final several verses there, chapter 2 up to verse 13, where Paul says, of course, Peter came to Antioch and was doing just fine with table fellowship and eating with Gentiles, with no concern about the Torah kosher lifestyle. But then when some folks came from Jerusalem, Peter drew back, got hardline about the Torah, took Barnabas with him apparently on that attitudinal change, and Paul had to call him out, because Peter knew from what Paul had said about the discussion in Jerusalem that the Jewish leadership had already agreed that that Jewish Torah lifestyle was not a requirement for Gentiles who were in Jesus' communities. As I suggested, there's conflict here, even internally, just as there was conflict internally at Philippi, apparently to a degree at Thessaloniki, certainly in Corinth. And while it's true that in his letters, Paul also commends his communities for their faith and their faithfulness and their generosity and the reputation that they are gaining all around their region or the world for testifying to the truth of the gospel. And even that sometimes, especially in terms of faithfulness and generosity, can be a little bit sarcastic, we think. Nevertheless, despite all of that positive affirmation, the bulk of Paul's letters is given over to addressing conflict. That seems to be even beyond the persecution that's reflected, for example, in the letter to the Philippians, or the persecution that Paul talks about of his own self in 2 Corinthians. Even beyond the external persecution, it's the internal conflict that Paul offers us in his telling of the story of the early Jesus communities. We'll see in our next session what Luke makes of all this in his retelling. But for this session, enough for now. I look forward to our conversation. God bless.